Murders at Karlov Manor is one of the notorious hat sets, and for the large part of its existence has been criticized for throwing hats and fedoras on literally anything that breathes. I personally enjoyed the set, but that is a pretty biased opinion because my channel is literally called Unpopular MTG. Like, when a set gets poor reception from a large part of the community, I become even more interested in the sets because that means there are so many hidden gems waiting to catch people by surprise in Commander games because either they never took a look at the cards in the actual set or they haven't seen it played because no one else is playing them. In this video, I'll be covering several cards from MKM that I think are just so much better than the total number of decks that they're played in would suggest. And while I was already planning on making this video, I will shout out a comment on one of my recent videos from Alex Sapphire, who said they'd love to see cards from Streets of New Capenna or Murders at Karlov Manor because those are both slept on sets. And yes, both sets have expensive lands that garner most of the interest from a pack opening perspective, but as Alex Sapphire's comment mentions, there's just so many treasures in the set that's waiting to be uncovered. So before we actually get into the cards, as you may know, I made a goal to get to know all of you better, so I will highlight a patron in each video moving forward. Our patron highlight today is eggstaylor.ttv, who is from, quote, beautiful San Diego, but currently in the 120 degree hail of Arizona. Their words exactly, not mine. But yeah, that's a little too hot for my liking too. Eggs Taylor started playing this year, and their favorite commander, lore-wise, is the Yawgmoth Thran Physician, but gameplay-wise is River Song. Their favorite pet cards are Edgin Larcenous Lutenist and Dream Devourer to invest mana into future. I actually reviewed one of their decks that it was brilliant. Like, it plays a lot of wheel effects after you've already foretold your cards. So as you draw as many cards as everyone else, you have access to foretold and plotted cards as pretty much an extension of your hand. Outside of MTG, they were a thespian of San Diego, top 50 in Destiny 2 PvP, and has been working at Sony for almost 7 years. All super cool. Like, thanks so much, Eggs Tailored, for being a patron. It's been awesome having you in the community, and yeah, honestly love these highlights and learning more about patrons and MTG players in general. But yeah, I'm excited to jump into discussing the cards today. First up, we have Anzrag's Rampage, which is in 17,697 decks. This is a 5-mana sorcery that says, destroy all artifacts you don't control. Then exile the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of artifacts that were put into the graveyards from the battlefield this turn. You may put a creature card exiled this way onto the battlefield. It gains haste. Return it to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. This card has never not been amazing for me. It's a one-sided board wipe against the most prominent form of ramp in the game and utility pieces, like, in general. Despite being one-sided, it's still, like, hugely slept on. I think largely because it says exile the cards from the top of your library as opposed to putting them in your graveyard or the unused ones on the bottom of your library. There's just a huge aversion to losing things permanently, but I see this card as a means to filter through my deck and cheat in some amazing creature outside of the already good standalone effect of destroying everyone else's artifacts. I've cheated in some, like, crazy good creatures before, and I love it because this card lets you leverage attack triggers, unlike other cards that bring a creature onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. While those are good for having ETBs, if your creature has an attack trigger, that doesn't happen if they enter already attacking. So the fact that you get the ETB in the main phase, attack with them in the combat phase, then return them is just really nice. A small detail and rule of this card that is often overlooked is that X is the number of artifacts that were put into a graveyard from the battlefield this turn. It doesn't specify opponent's artifacts, And it doesn't say like only the artifacts that were destroyed this way. It's just all that have been destroyed this turn, period. This means that it doesn't matter if people sacrifice their treasures in response to your spell. This also means that you could sacrifice 5 treasures to pay for this spell, and X would already be a base of 5, because before anyone else's artifacts are destroyed, you sacrifice 5 treasures, and that counts for you too, because it went into your graveyard. And so that wording is pretty nice, because yeah, it will count anything that happened before the cast took place. The last thing that I like about this card is that it doesn't have a stipulation on CMC of the creature you cheat in. Like many cards like this say to exile or look at the top X cards of your library and cast a spell with mana value X or less, where X is the number of artifacts put into the battle graveyard this way. This could literally just exile 1 card, and it could hit something like a Pathrazor of Ulamog to cheat onto the battlefield with haste, or instant scoops if you hit a Grave Titan in one single roll, you know? And so the fact that it can hit any creature is just really nice. There's enough small details about this card that I was literally able to ramble on for the past few minutes about multiple overlooked clauses. I'm curious, what do you think about this? Our next card is Whipstrinker Vampire, which is in 15,495 decks. This is a 4-mana 2/4 with flying. It costs 2 generic, 1 white, and 1 black. And it says, whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Then for 7 mana, it's pretty steep, but yeah, 5 generic, 1 white, 1 black. Creatures you control with power 2 or less gain Death Touch and Lifelink until end of turn. This card reminds me of a 4-mana version of Corpse Knight, which is in almost 88,000 decks as opposed to just 15,000. And the extra mana actually comes with a few added benefits in this case. First of all, Whipstrinker is nice because it has both edges of the sword for small tokens or creature decks. It drains each opponent, but it also gives you 1 life. So it enables a lot of life gain decks and synergies. This also doesn't say for non-token creatures or the clause of when 1 or more creatures. So if you have like 8 or 10 plus creatures enter all at once, it will create 10 separate instances of life gain that can trigger on the stack. And depending on your deck, you could give +1/+1 counters, or like if you have Amalia Benavides Aguirre, then it will just explore 10 times. I will say the activated ability is crazy expensive, but it is still there nonetheless. So it gives you that option for crazy life gain or holding up mana for instance, or deter blockers with the possible wall of Death Touch blockers that they could be attacking into. The last thing that I will mention about this card is that it has relevant creature types. It could be a rogue for Barakos Party Leader or party decks in general, or a vampire for Edgar Markov from Karlov Manor. And yes, there are many other commanders that could be good for this, but I'm curious if there's anything that comes to mind when you think and read this card. Our third card today is Officious Interrogation, which is in 14,270 decks. This one is actually pretty nuts if you ask me. It is 2 mana, it costs 1 white and 1 blue for an instant that says, the spell costs 1 white, 1 blue more to cast for each target beyond the first. Choose any number of target players. Investigate X times, where X is the total number of creatures those players control. Like, are you kidding me? That is like so good. The ceiling of this card is literally infinite. There's 3 things in particular that I think is just wild about this. 1, you choose the player and investigate X, where X is the number of creatures that player controls. So you don't even have to be the one that has a wide board state, and you could benefit from someone having 50 or 100 Scoot Swarms. The second thing is this is essentially a multi-kicker card. If you have 4 white mana and 4 blue mana, you could create as many clue tokens as there are creatures on the battlefield. And the third thing is that this is an instant, which is what puts this card over the top for me. And when I say this card could go infinite, you could literally win the game in the middle of an opponent's infinite loop. All you need on the battlefield, like you need to be in a Jeskai deck that is playing cards like Reckless Fireweaver, Ingenious Artillerist, or Weft Stalker Ardent, or something along those lines. If they have something that creates an infinite number of creatures, let's say you don't interrupt it, and you don't cancel their combo piece, so they think, all right, I'm good to go, and they just assume that's game. But you could interrupt them on, let's say, their 900th trigger and cast this with any of those creatures that I mentioned on the board, and this will deal 900 damage to each opponent. They don't expect it because I can't think of any other card that has the potential to create double or triple digit artifact tokens at instant speed for 2 mana. Obviously, you don't need someone to create an infinite number of creatures. Even a Scoot Swarm or something that can create 10 or 20 tokens at once under one single player could be 20 direct damage to the face to the entire board. Maybe you don't want to deal direct damage. You could one-shot someone with Kappa Cannoneer or Arcbound Crusher, or just create a ton of treasures with Academy Manufacturer. If you're in Azori's colors and you care about the number of artifact tokens that you can amass, this is definitely one that I think you should be considering. If this is your first time here or you're a longtime viewer, please consider joining us in the Unpopular MTG Patreon to get access to the Discord. We discuss all things underrated cards, and I share my thoughts on several of these cards before the videos are released to just have fun discussions with the group. Our next card is Analyze the Pollen, which is in 12,066 decks. I typically don't play tutors, but this is one that I'm fine with playing. It is a 1-mana sorcery that says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, you may collect Evidence 8. I'm going to read this once because this will come up on some cards. Collect Evidence says, exile cards with total mana value 8 or greater from your graveyard. So, search your library for a basic land card. If Evidence was collected, instead, search your library for a creature or a land card. Reveal that card, put it into your hand, then shuffle. So yeah, as I mentioned, I don't normally play tutors, but I'm totally fine with this with the extra hoops that I have to jump through, and it's just unpopular in general. And if you're saying, well, that's not really much of an additional requirement for a tutor, you're absolutely right. Like, I totally agree with you. Worst case, this gives you a basic land, which in many cases can save your butt if you were going to miss a land drop that turn. But in the case that you do collect Evidence for the additional cost, you can tutor any creature in your deck right to your hand for just 1 mana. And the other really nice part is that you can search for any land, and not just basic land. It's not quite like the game changer crop rotation because it doesn't put it directly onto the battlefield. But unlike crop rotation, you can still tutor for literally any busted land without having to sacrifice a land as an additional cost. I actually don't think that Collect Evidence is as big of a boogeyman that people make it out to be. Yeah, those cards are exiled forever, but so are the cards that if someone plays a Bajuka Bog or any piece of graveyard hate. If you're not in Izzet colors, then you're likely not planning to recur instants and sorceries, so those are excellent candidates for collecting Evidence, and especially if you have split cards, where the CMC counts as the sum of both sides. Lastly, this just synergizes really well with cards that have a benefit when a card leaves the graveyard, which is why it does so much work in my reworked Taval the Balanced Scale precon. I'd love to hear, what are your thoughts on Collect Evidence? Does it feel like a really steep cost to you, or is that something that you don't mind paying as an additional cost? We're going to be dropping all the way down to 8,579 decks next with Treacherous Greed. This is a 3-mana instant that says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature that dealt damage this turn. Draw 3 cards. Each opponent loses 3 life and you gain 3 life. So in every video, I have a card that I caveat is more niche than any of the other cards that I share in the video. And this is the card today that gets that caveat. It can be a tough one for some decks to play, but the decks that this does work in, it feels really good to cast. And there's a few things in particular that I think are really good for this card. One, obviously the restriction of a creature needing to deal damage this turn is the hardest requirement about this. However, it is very generic. It's just damage in general. So that can be, it doesn't have to be combat damage. It can be non-combat damage. It could be to a creature. It could be to a player, to an opponent, whatever it is. So this works if you have any creature that can deal non-combat damage directly to opponents or creatures. You might not, want to be sacrificing a creature that is that beneficial, but this is an instant. So you could also cast it in response to a removal spell to draw 3 and pay 3 or ping the board for 3 as well. The second part that is nice is that you sacrifice a creature, so that triggers death effects, and that's in colors that care about it. Orzhov is always looking for death triggers. The third thing, other than having creatures that can deal non-combat damage, this goes great in token decks or decks that have the ability to give your creatures first strike. So you could either have a ton of 1/1s without flying, or even just a few 1/1s with flying. Then those creatures, they attack, you get by with a single 1/1 flyer, and then you can just sacrifice it after combat to draw 3 cards and pretty much lightning bolt all of your opponents and gain that life too. Or if you have a token or small creature with first strike, you could attack or block, then sacrifice a creature between the first strike damage and the other creature dealing the damage deals it back. So that might be a little more narrow of a use case, but it still does exist if you have creatures with first strike. So I've never had a problem casting this card as much as people might think, because the decks that I choose to run this in really don't have any issues, because I have just a lot of tokens that can deal damage to my opponents. Next up, we have Connecting the Dots, which is in 8,423 decks. This card costs 2 mana for an enchantment that says, whenever a creature you control attacks, exile the top card of your library face down. Then for 1 generic and 1 red, discard your hand, sacrifice Connecting the Dots. Put all cards exiled with Connecting the Dots into their owner's hands. So this card is an excellent card draw spell in red, and one that can actually go positive as opposed to just replacing itself. There's so many cards in red that say you need to discard something and then draw 2 cards. So after the card that you discard and the card itself drawing, you just lost 2 in order to draw 2. What's nice about the attack clause on this card is that it triggers for each creature, not just 1 or more, or when they attack each opponent. So having 3 creatures attack across 2 different turns would already be 6 cards that you're ready to draw. The last 2 things that I'll say about this is that you discard your hand, so it works really well in discard decks, or cards that care about the number of cards you discard for filling up your graveyard. The other aspect is that it puts the cards directly into your hand. You don't draw them. So in the rarer instances that someone is actually playing anti-card draw stacks pieces, this can evade that, which is, great. I'd love to hear if anyone has ever played this card, what they think of it. We're halfway through. Our next card is Deadly Cover-Up, which is in 7,668 decks. This is a 5-mana sorcery that says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, you may collect evidence 6. Destroy all creatures. If evidence was collected, exile a card from an opponent's graveyard, then search its owner's graveyard, hand, and library for any number of cards with that name and exile them. That player shuffles, then draws a card for each card exiled from their hand this way. There's actually a lot to talk about this card. First of all, it's nothing like extraordinary as a board wipe. It only hits creatures and it is a destroy board wipe, not exile. But if you are in the market for a typical creature board wipe, then this is an option that I really like. The first time I ever read this, I glazed over this and I thought that the collect evidence clause was pretty useless in this case if you're not going against a deck that plays cards with multiple copies like Heir Apparent or any of those other ones. But this is actually a lot stronger than you think, and for 3 reasons in particular. 1, is that you can permanently get rid of a troublesome card that an opponent has been recurring or could easily recur from the graveyard, and so having that gone completely is nice insurance. The second thing is that even though you know for a fact that a person is only playing one copy of a card, you can still search their hand. You won't find the additional copies, but looking at someone's hand as a result of casting a board wipe will give you perfect knowledge of what answers or threats they have in their hand. You don't have to exile a threat from someone's graveyard. You can just pick the player who you're most worried about, or pick the control player to see how many counterspells they have in hand, or something like that. And the third thing that is actually pretty insane, that comes directly from the rules of this card, it says, unlike many other effects of this kind, Deadly Cover-Up allows you to exile a basic land. Granted, a basic land has to be in the graveyard, but that is like absolutely hilarious. If it's a monocolored deck, exiling all the basic lands from their hand, graveyard, and deck could just absolutely cripple them for the rest of the game. This could work in Dimir mill decks, where you can get a basic land in their graveyard really easily by having them mill it. You could exile, 15 or 20 plus basic lands of a monocolored deck, and maybe they'll draw one or two because they had those in their hand. But the next turn, if they drew two, then they might have to discard that. The last thing is this also works with Rakdos if you play something like Sundering Eruption or Stone Rain. But yeah, just like most of the cards that I covered today, there are just like small wordings that are super easy to overlook, but it makes a total difference once you actually realize what the card can do. For the last four, I'm actually just going to rapid fire them because they're great cards. I want to call attention to them, but reading the cards pretty much explains them. We have Extract a Confession, which is in 7,360 decks. This card costs 2, and it says, as an additional cost to cast a spell, you may collect evidence 6. Each opponent sacrifices a creature. If evidence was collected, instead, each opponent sacrifices a creature with the greatest power among creatures they control. So yeah, really good effect, even with the base, but once you have the collect evidence, it's even more powerful. I'm curious if you prefer having something sacrifice their creature with the most power, or do you like the route that Soul Shatter goes, where they have to sacrifice the creature with the highest CMC instead of power. Next up, we have Get a Leg Up, which is in 6,572 decks. This costs 1, it's an instant, and says, until end of turn, target creature gets +1/+1 for each creature you control and gains reach. This card can realistically enable one-shots with a commander in like Selesnya token decks after no blocks have been declared against your commander. And the other thing that I really like is it gives reach, which is a nice effect for blocking, but it's also an instant and it says target creature. So you could give your opponent's commander, let's say, +15/+15 out of nowhere, and you could have their commander knock out one of your opponents instead. So having the flexibility to buff either your creature or your opponent's creature at instant speed is just really great. Our second to last card is Vengeful Tracker, which is in 5,563 decks. This says it costs 2 for a Human Detective 2/2, and it says whenever an opponent sacrifices an artifact, Vengeful Tracker deals 2 damage to them. I'm honestly surprised this sees so little play. 2 mana is so cheap, it's asymmetric, and what I mean by that is it doesn't hurt you when you sacrifice an artifact, it only hurts opponents. So it's a great silver bullet against some of the most prominent cards in Commander, which is treasures, clues, and foods. Worst case scenario, this is a 2 mana creature that is good enough and strong enough to flush out removal that an opponent otherwise could have used on one of your big creatures instead. And our last card today is Urgent Necropsy, which is in 2,306 decks. This is an instant that says, as an additional cost to cast a spell, collect evidence X, where X is the total mana of the permanents this spell targets. Destroy up to 1 target artifact, up to 1 target creature, up to 1 target enchantment, and up to 1 target planeswalker. I've actually come to love this card. I've already mentioned that I do not see collect evidence as a problem. This is great because it's instant speed and you have the chance to 4-for-1 the table. And there's always tokens on the board, so you could just remove tokens for free because they don't have any mana values. So no additional collect evidence costs are needed for creatures or artifact tokens that you want to remove. If you're not planning to recur instants and sorceries, like I said, in Golgari, you could just exile something like a Flare of Malice or any others like that and destroy a creature, a target artifact, enchantment, or planeswalker. And that's pretty great for 4 mana if you ask me. But yeah, that's everything that I have today. Like I said, I really enjoy Murders at Karlov Manor, and I think that it is criminally underrated. So I really do hope that this video was helpful and that there were some cards that maybe you've overlooked in the past, but now reading them and hearing them, you're like, wow, I really need to get that or get something for XYZ deck. I'd love to hear what you think of this, and if there are any other sets that you'd like me to cover in terms of underrated gems and bangers that most people overlook. So thanks everyone for being here, and we'll see you next time.